There was decades upon decades upon decades of systemic racism. So for this topic, we're going to go back to the 1960s. And it wasn't the war on drugs that started all, it was the war on crime.
In order to understand the war on drugs, we have to talk about the origins of the criminalization of Black communities. As we've discussed, this has been consistent throughout American history. But debates on how to address drug use in society began to affect Black communities more directly in the 1960s. Even though President Lyndon B. Johnson is best known for his Great Society legislation and passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he also declared what was called a war on crime in March of 1965. The war on crime was not exactly the same as the war on drugs, but it put in place many of the same powers that would eventually make the war on drugs as expansive and devastating as it was. The war on crime produced the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which in 1965 authorized the federal government to take a direct role in militarizing local police. Then, the Safe Streets Act of 1968 invested $400 million in the war on crime and created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration to oversee the funding. Most of it went to supervise and surveil low-income urban communities, even though those communities weren't the only places that crime and drugs could be found. But low-income urban communities are where Black people often lived.
So let the games begin. But I'm going to go back before I talk to the panel. That was step one. Step one, you could kind of look at it as getting physical evidence. I know it's a better term, and you'll understand what I mean when I play the next video. Step one was getting the physical evidence, getting the data, so to speak. Their data, but getting the data, so to speak. Step two is now you're going to have to turn that data into propaganda.
These policies and research, like the Moynihan Report, a report on the poverty in Black communities, served to develop and spread stereotypes about Black urban poverty. They said that the tangle of poverty and drug use was largely the result of individual and cultural flaws. The Moynihan Report said that, quote, at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family. It is the fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community at the present time. Moynihan acknowledged racism still played a role, but seemed to think that the real issue was the structure of Black families, which, given all the structural impediments Black people were facing, just seems off base. All of this helped lead to the end of the previous war on poverty and shape the rationale, legislation, and policies for the war on crime.
So, we have the data, which you fundamentally made sure that you had the data by concentrating on a certain group of people. So it wasn't wide range, it wasn't a mix of, it was your data on a certain group of people. So you took that data, made a report saying, well, this is the reason why the Black community is degrading every day. This is what our information has shown you. It shows you that no matter how many times we have sat there and said crime is everywhere, drugs is everywhere, it doesn't matter. When you think of drugs, the report tells you automatically think of the Black community, Black and brown community. When you think of crime, you automatically think of the Black and brown community because it was constructed to be that way. That was the point of it. It wasn't a mix of information. It was a systematic, pinpoint look at a certain group. So, anybody can talk now.
All right, well, the 1960s is, I get you got to pick up from somewhere, but America has always criminalized the black body. That's how we were able to dehumanize us and subjugate our people and putting us into slavery. So they've been doing it since day one. We were brutes, we were monsters, we had to be tamed. Um, Slavery was necessary to, what's the word that they use? Socialize the black savage, you know, even though we're the fathers of education. But anyway, all that stuff goes all the way back. I mean, people may be tired of hearing me saying it, but the nature of the European is fucking evil. I'm sorry. You know what I'm saying? And yeah, you roll it forward, you come into the 60s. By the time we got to the 60s, even though America typically fights over the color line, it wasn't all about the color line. By the time you start sliding into that part of American history, it's more about, notice that it's the war on drugs, it's the war on crime, but it's never the war on poverty. And poverty is sitting at the base of your crime issues, your drug issues, right? It's never the war on corporate greed, or it's never the war on, they never focus the war on what's coming into the country. They just focus on once it's already in the country, right? So it's all smoke and mirrors, man. It's all smoke and mirrors. So yeah, I hear what old boy was saying, but I'm not overly impressed with his presentation.
Okay.
Well, you
What would
asked,
you
man.
what would you do differently, Fierce?
I don't know. I guess I would have brought more context like I just did. I mean, but like I said, you got to start from somewhere, and that was the point that he chose to start from. So okay, cool. So we look at it from the Johnson or whatever, but there were a lot of other factors that he could have put in there as well. But I guess when it takes you 20 minutes to say 3 words, you got to be kind of careful how much you try to put out there. I don't know. So this isn't me attacking him. I mean, do your thing. It's just his style of presentation is not to my particular fancy.
Well, that's why we're here. We're here to prep it up a little bit. He gives the information. We give a more deep understanding about what he said.
Right.
So, and you're right. We're starting at the 60s because we're on this certain topic of saying about the war on drugs. That's why we're starting in the 1960s on this topic. But you're right. Been going on since we got off the boat.
And then even if you
when they got us on the boat.
It was before that, because it was the Pope that decided that it was okay to enslave Africans. But I was also going to say the war on drugs. It's all about criminalizing the person or the community. It's not about the drugs. It's never about the drugs. So when China decided they weren't going to keep getting high off their opium, we went to war with them. When black people were the ones that were on heroin in the 20s, it was called black tar, and it was criminalizing us based on heroin use. But ever since that time, white folks been the one on heroin for the most part. So it stopped being in the news. It stopped being a forefront thing. And then when you roll into, the 60s, now it's marijuana. Well, who else is doing marijuana? It was the hippies. It was the young people. So you start to criminalize them, because how were they voting? They were voting liberal. They were opposing structures. They were pushing back against societal constructs, right? They were doing those things, and that gets in the way of the conservative the conservative is always, but I think back then they were still Democrats. It gets in the way. So it's always like, look, just below where they're trying to point our heads towards, and then the war on drugs, it became its own thing coming out of the 60s and the 70s. A lot of money tied into it. I made a point not long ago that you look at the criminal justice infrastructure of America, if crime actually started to go down, we know what America would do because it's done it in the past when crime dropped a little bit too much. It goes and makes new laws to create new crime because it has to feed the machine. So the war on drugs is just another term for the crime or the police apparatus that is. Imagine if you were able to get drugs under control. What would happen? You would have communities that instead of fighting each other, they would start fighting outside of each other. That becomes a problem. And then how many lawyers will lose their jobs? How many judges? How many parole officers? How many correctional officers? There's an entire infrastructure that says we have to keep people criminals. We warehouse in prison. We warehouse more people in America than any other country.
We're gonna get to that. I got the numbers on that. I got literally the data on that.